right, good evening. Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight, which program devoted to what I think is a pretty fascinating subject, and I'm sure you all agree. That's why you're here. Glad to see you. Our guest tonight, author Lorett Treese, served as college archivist at Bryn Mawr College for 20 years, following an earlier career in business, advertising, and public relations. She holds an undergraduate degree from Bryn Mawr College and an MA in American History from Villanova University. She's been writing books and articles about American history for over 30 years. She's written about the American Revolution and its commemoration, business history, and railroad history, as well as insider guides to a number of historic sites. We're pleased to have her back with us tonight. It's been several years since she's been here, but please welcome Lorett Treese.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all for coming on a cold, dark night like this. I came to talk about my book, which is called A Serpent's Tale. A lot of people ask me about the title. Now, the title of the book is also the title of the first chapter, which happens to be a modern history of the Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio. Now, why start the book about mound builders with the Serpent Mound? Well, in my opinion, the Serpent Mound is kind of like the poster child for all the remains left behind by the prehistoric Native American cultures that we know today as the Hopewell, Adena, and Fort Ancient cultures that were formerly collectively called the Mound Builder people. These people, these prehistoric people, left behind literally thousands of earthen remains in the Midwest, primarily the Ohio River Valley. And when Caucasians first came into this area, they were frankly amazed to see that North America had ancient ruins. Now, what exactly is the Serpent Mound? Why is it so famous? Perhaps the most famous of all the mound builder remains. It's a sculpture. It's shaped like a snake with a coiled tail. It's over 1,300 feet long, so it's a very large sculpture. It's made out of dirt and rocks mixed with clay and ash. It's stretching open its mouth to swallow an egg or whatever this is supposed to be here. And as for when it was built, well, there's recently been some controversy on the date, but the date that's still accepted by scholars is about 1070 AD. And where it was built is also very interesting. It's on a kind of a plateau that overlooks a creek. And if you look at this rock formation in exactly the right angle, the rock formation, the edge of it, looks a little bit like a snake's head. So apparently this is a location that was very, very carefully chosen by these prehistoric people to erect this particular sculpture. Now, if you were coming into this area for the first time, if you were an explorer or an early settler, and you came across something like this, you would naturally ask some questions, starting with, what is it? And probably followed by who built it and why did they build it? What was it used for? Why is it here? What my book is actually about is all of the people who asked those questions from the 18th century on, and how these seekers, these antiquarians and later scholars, have made Ohio, in my opinion, the birthplace of American archaeology. Now, besides your random Indian traders and squatters coming into the Ohio River Valley, probably the first people to really systematically explore the area would have been missionaries and military scouts. Now, these were people of some education, and they began bringing back these stories of conically shaped mounds, mounds shaped like cones, and also earthworks that could be geometrically shaped, shaped like a circle, a square, maybe a complex of a circle and a square put together, or a circle and an octagon. These look to 18th century eyes a little bit like forts, except that the walls were too low, except that there were too many intentional gaps in the walls. And sometimes the area surrounded by these earthen walls was very large. It could be 50 or 100 acres. all of these things would have made these indefensible and kind of useless to really be forts for warfare as it was practiced in the late 18th century. And what made these ruins even more interesting was the fact that the Indians who lived nearby couldn't explain them. Now, the reason for that probably was that during the 1600s, there was a conflict between the Iroquois nations and the Algonquian-speaking people that we sometimes call the Beaver Wars. This was sort of a lengthy conflict for control of the fur trade, the European fur trade. To make a long story short, the Iroquois won, and they claimed domination over much of the Midwest, including the Ohio River Valley. For a while, this area would have emptied out, and then Indians from other tribes began moving into this area, primarily Delawares and Shawnee. But they had not grown up in that area. They were also newcomers to the area, just as white people were. So, of course, they couldn't explain the Mound Builder ruins. The mysterious ruins were so interesting that they were also of interest to some of our premier men of science of the era, including Thomas Jefferson. Before he was President of the United States, he was President of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. And his society organized a committee, the purpose of which was to try to get some good diagrams, descriptions, measure drawings of some of these mound builder ruins. Now, Ohio became a political entity in 1787 with the Northwest Ordinance, which opened it for legal settlement. There were squatters already there. A lot of the first legal settlers were veterans of the American Revolution, and many of them came from New England. So they were fairly educated Yankees. They were actually going to pose the first threat to the mound builder ruins, because unlike the missionaries and the traders, they weren't there just temporarily. They were there to settle down and stick around. So they were going to build farms, they were going to build roads and fences and plow the land. Eventually they would be building canals as well. And essentially they'd be laying their footprint over the landscape, and of course, in so doing, erasing the traces of this prior civilization. Now, there were some exceptions. There were some early attempts to save some of the mound builder ruins. The people who settled the town of Marietta, Ohio, purposely laid out the grid pattern for the streets of their town so that they'd be able to save some of the earthen walls of an enclosure and some of the mounds in that area. And if you go to Marietta today, you can still see these remains. Also, the Grave Creek Mound was saved. This was one of those conical mounds. It's still located today in a West Virginia town, which is called Moundsville. One of the reasons why it was saved is, well, it was so big, it's over 60 feet high for one thing. But the man who owned the land on which it stood refused to let it be destroyed. His descendants later did excavate it, but they did it in a way that would have preserved the shape of the mound. And what did they find inside? Well, they found a couple of burial chambers and a couple of human burials, accompanied by grave goods, things made out of copper, mica, and seashells. Now, if you were looking for buried treasure, that probably would have been a great disappointment. But they were hoping to make sort of like a tourist attraction out of this, and that might have been another reason why it got saved. From the early to the middle part of the 19th century, there were also some attempts to at least document these ruins. And some of the earliest books written about them, there was one written by a man named Caleb Atwater, published in 1820, in which he documented a lot of mound builder remains throughout Ohio. There was another one written by a man named Daniel Drake. He happened to be a doctor, and he documented a rather extensive series of remains on the shore of the Ohio River, just exactly where Cincinnati was also being built at the time. Now, if you go to Ohio today, some of the remains that Caleb Atwater documented, you can still see. But as for what Drake documented, we only have his records on paper, because what's down there now in southern Cincinnati, right along the riverfront, there's a number of major highways, and there's also the sports stadiums and their associated parking lots. And when we were last in Cincinnati, my husband made a joke. He said, "Lorett, the only mound you're going to find here is the one that the pitcher stands on down at the ballpark." But anyway, Ohio at one time, it is estimated, had 10,000 of these earthwork remains. Today, there's maybe about 1,000 left. Now, at this time too, this early to middle 19th century, this is a time when Americans and also Europeans are becoming kind of fascinated with the classical past. The ruins of Pompeii are discovered in the 1700s. Napoleon comes back from Egypt with documents and artifacts. A lot of the architects and decorative artists at the time are drawing upon classical motifs. You can see it in architecture built in this time period. You can also see it in fashion. If you think of the empire-style gowns that ladies were wearing with the high waist, you sometimes would wear it with a stole around your shoulders. If you picture Josephine Bonaparte in your mind, this is what I'm thinking of. This style of fashion was meant to make you look like a Roman matron. And also cities in America that are rising in this time period were sometimes given classical sounding names, or even directly classical names. We have several places in the United States called Athens. We have a couple places called Rome. We have a Troy, a Syracuse, a Cairo, a Memphis. Everybody's becoming kind of very, very fascinated with the classical past. So the mound builder remains are very tempting to some Americans to imagine that perhaps they are evidence that America also had a classical past. And this gives rise to a lot of theories that we find today like amusing and kind of silly, but people took them seriously at the time. For example, the enclosures look a little bit like forts. Well, the Romans built forts and they got as far as Britain. Maybe they somehow came over here and built these enclosures. Or better yet, maybe the Phoenicians came over here, since we know that they were seafarers. One scholar proposed that perhaps the mound builder ruins were built by Hindus from India who somehow got over here. Anyway, there were a lot of theories. Oh, including one, it had to happen. Perhaps the mound builder remains were built by the refugees and the survivors of the lost continent of Atlantis. And all of these were very seriously proposed. The trend to document, at least on paper, the mound builder remains gets more or less professionalized around the middle of the 19th century, when the Smithsonian Institution publishes a book, which is a collection of descriptions and diagrams of earthen remains throughout what they define as the Mississippi Valley, in which they include the Ohio River Valley. Now, the authors of this particular book are Ephraim George Squire and Edwin Hamilton Davis. Neither one of them was an archaeologist, because there was no such thing as a professional archaeologist at the time. Davis was a medical doctor, and Squire was a newspaper reporter. But together they traveled throughout the area, the Midwest, and they also sent field agents out, and they explored and diagrammed and also excavated a lot of these remains. They made some very good diagrams that were preserved in their book and are still used by archaeologists today. And in fact, on the cover of my book, this happens to be the Squire and Davis diagram of the Serpent Mound. And it's like a bird's eye view. And you can see the contour of the rise here. You can see it's overlooking a creek, which is right here. These are a better view of the mound builder remains than anybody had ever had before. And another thing that Squire and Davis provided us are the first representations of some of the artifacts that they were digging up from these mounds. And Americans got a look at for the very first time at what very talented craftspeople these mound builders were. Perhaps the best expression of their craftsmanship would have been their making of their animal effigy pipes. Now, what is that? It's a pipe for smoking tobacco or whatever it is that you happen to be smoking, in which the bowl of the pipe was shaped like an animal, often very naturalistically carved. And the bowl, where am I here? The bowl was also located not at the end of the pipe, but in the middle. And if you, the Ohio Historical, State Historical Agency is called the Ohio History Center. And that's their state museum. And if you Google that, you'll see some very good representations of these animal effigy pipes, the artwork of the Mound Builders. And one thing that Squire and Davis noted was that the raw materials that these mound builders were using to create their artifacts would often come from far away as the Great Lakes, the Gulf of Mexico, the eastern seaboard, all areas that are very geographically distant from the Ohio River Valley. Now, Squire and Davis, somehow, they just couldn't, despite all their observation and everything they learned about the mounds, they just couldn't let go of that idea that somehow or other the mound builders had been something other than Indians. They didn't speculate a lot on exactly who the mound builders were, unlike other scholars of the day. But they did say that these mound builders must have been living in a very different kind of society than the Indians of their own day. Now this bias, this prejudice, kind of persists throughout most of the 19th century until late in the 19th century, when the Smithsonian Institution, once again, creates its Bureau of Ethnology under the direction of John Wesley Powell. Now, if the name John Wesley Powell is sort of familiar to you, he's much more famous for another one of his accomplishments, which was leading an expedition down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. But he also became the first director of the Bureau of Ethnology. Now, when the Bureau was established in 1879, Powell had no idea that they were going to study ancient Indians. His plan was to study the culture of Indians of his own day. But when Congress went to fund this particular organization, there was one congressman who happened to come from Ohio who added to their mission that they would also be studying the mound builders, and he made sure that money was appropriated for this particular study. And this fell to another scientist named Cyrus Thomas, who decided to re-examine, together with his own field agents, all the earthworks of the Midwest in order to answer one deceptively simple question: were the mound builders Native Americans? And his answer, which was published in various publications between 1887 and 1894, was yes, of course, the mound builders were Native Americans. So once we kind of agreed on who the mound builders had been, the next question became, when were these artifacts built? And that kind of related to like a larger question of when man would have first come to the Western Hemisphere. Now, no hominid, such as Neanderthal man, no remains of any hominid has ever been found in the Western Hemisphere. So it came to be accepted that Homo sapiens, that's us, would have already come to dominate the human species by the time anybody moved over here. But for a long time, in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was thought that man had not been in the Western Hemisphere very long, maybe only as long as 3,000 or 4,000 years. Now, the beginning of the 20th century, these mound builders that always had been spoken of collectively, it began to look like to more professional archaeologists that perhaps there was not one homogeneous group of people, but maybe different cultures at work here. Perhaps there was a higher or more advanced culture and a more primitive culture. That's what the remains seem to be showing. Now, archaeologists came up with the term Hopewell, in order to describe what appeared to be the higher or the more advanced culture. Where did they get the name Hopewell? It happened to be the name of a man who owned a piece of ground on which one of the archaeologists, a famous guy named Warren K. Moorhead, happened to be excavating. So the name Hopewell or Hopewell culture came to be adopted for this particular Native American society. These are the people who made the more sophisticated earthworks and mounds. And of course, we have no idea what these people called themselves. A little later, during the first decade of the 20th century, there was another Ohio archaeologist named William Corliss Mills, who unlocked for us the secret of the Hopewell Mounds. His research showed that most of them had started out as what he described as charnel houses, meaning places for the disposal, the processing of the bodies of your people, the dead bodies of your people. He discovered that most of these areas started out as sort of like a defined area, defined by a palisade, which would have enclosed one or more crematory basins where bodies would be cremated, and then separate areas or rooms for the burial of human remains together with artifacts, such as the animal effigy pipes. And then when the areas for burial got filled up, what the Hopewell people would do was burn the whole thing down and then raise a mound to mark the place where it had been. Now we think that Mills was probably more or less right in his supposition, but you won't hear any archaeologists today use the word charnel house to describe this. Archaeologists and even anthropologists tend to use the Native American term today, big house or spirit house, to describe this kind of a ceremonial structure. William Corliss Mills worked a lot with another man named Henry Clyde Trone. One of the sites that they are famous for is called Mound City, which is located outside of Chillicothe in Ohio. What is Mound City? It's a roughly rectangular enclosure that encloses a whole lot of these Hopewell mounds. Now, at the time that they did their excavations there, which was 1920 and 1921, Mound City might not have seemed like a very good site to be excavating, because not only had Squire and Davis already been there and dug up a lot of these mounds, but during World War I, the Army National Guard established a training camp there. So this sort of open area that was outside the town of Chillicothe, they built military barracks and military training facilities. They dug their own sewers. They even had a short line railroad. If you go there today, you won't see any of that. Mound City has now been restored to what it might have looked like, at least to Squire and Davis, and it is now maintained by the National Park Service as part of Hopewell Culture National Historical Park. And it's a very good place to go to visit if you are interested in the Hopewell culture. And if you don't want to drive to Chillicothe, they have a website, of course, with a lot of information on it. Around the 1920s and 30s, after the excavation of Mound City, the date for man's supposed entrance into the Western Hemisphere got pushed back rather significantly. In 1932, in a town called Clovis, New Mexico, an archaeologist discovered a weapon point, a spear point, embedded in the ribcage of what had been a woolly mammoth. So scholars were forced to conclude that man had been in the Western Hemisphere at least as long as these extinct woolly mammoths. But for a long time, the accepted theory, the accepted date came to be that around 12,000 BC, this would have been when Paleo-Indians, or Stone Age Indians, began to migrate south from Alaska, whence they had come from Siberia. And as they made their way south into the northern United States, they invented the Clovis point, this particular very distinctive spear point. And that made them into very efficient big game hunters. And Clovis points today have been found in all 48 of the contiguous states. They are not found in Asia, so there's something that was invented here. And they also kind of show us that by the time, and of course they've been found in Ohio, by the time that these Hopewell people were conducting their elaborate burial ceremonies, man had already been living in that area for quite some time. Today there's a new science, relatively new. It's called Archaea Astronomy, and its practitioners have been taking another look at these Hopewell enclosures, especially the geometrically shaped enclosures. In Newark, Ohio, there's an enclosure that happens to be, it's very big. It's a circle that's attached to an octagon. A lot of people thought it might have been a fort, but it had too many gaps in the wall. And now it looks like those gaps line up with celestial events, including the rising and setting sun at the solstices and equinoxes. And what's even more interesting, the rise and set points of the moon during an 18-year lunar cycle. So we're learning now that the Hopewell people had been rather adept astronomers. There's another site, another Hopewell site, which is called Fort Ancient, which is very near Lebanon, Ohio. Now, Fort Ancient is not a geometrically shaped Hopewell remain. It is an earthen ball, but it's on the top of a hill. So it's not geometric, it just kind of follows the terrain of the hill. And of course, early settlers thought it was a fort, that's why it was named Fort Ancient, but it had too many gaps in the wall. Now it looks like it also has like a series of mounds, and if you stand on the right mound, you can see the sunrise at the summer solstice. And very recently at Fort Ancient, and this encloses about 100 acres, it's a very big enclosure, archaeologists found that at one time, some Hopewell people, would have erected a circle of wooden posts that archaeologists call a wood henge. And this would have been erected and then very carefully de-erected. We don't know exactly what it was used for, but that was discovered as recently as 2005, and it's called the Moorhead Circle in honor of Warren K. Moorhead. So it just goes to show you that there's a lot about these remains we don't know even now, and that we are still learning. Now, what do we know about the Hopewell people, or what do we think we know? Well, we know that they probably shared a religion that would have caused them to bury their dead with a great deal of ceremony. They valued things from far away, raw materials from far away, that they would have attained either by traveling themselves or maybe welcoming pilgrims to their ceremonial sites, or maybe just through trading networks. The Indians had trading networks when white people already got here. When did they live? Well, there's various contingencies about the date. The dates accepted by the Ohio History Center are that the Hopewell people lived from about 200 BC until about 400 or 500 AD. And they had a lot of talented craftspeople. They did not have a written language, but they probably used symbols in their artwork that would have been very recognizable to them, but that we don't necessarily understand today. Now, besides the Hopewell people, it was clear in the late 19th century that there seemed to be another culture. The Hopewell remains were very beautiful and very finely crafted. There was this other culture where the remains, the things in the mounds that were coming out of the mounds, looked a little bit more primitive. So it looked like there were two cultures here, a higher one and a lower one. We needed a name for the other culture, and an archaeologist came up with the name Edina. Now, where does that come from? Well, William Corliss Mills happened to be excavating on an estate that was named Edina in Ohio, and he found a mound, and in that mound he found over 50 skeletons, together with grave offerings of copper rings and bracelets, weapon points, and seashells. So he adopted the name Edina for this other culture. And then in the 1920s and 30s, that gave rise to another controversy among archaeologists. Which culture came first, the Hopewell or the Adena? Did the Hopewell culture grow out of the Adena culture, or did it descend into the Adena culture? We got an answer to this question in the 1940s. The big news in archaeology in the 1940s was the discovery of radiocarbon dating. Now, for the first time, that gave archaeologists a way to objectively date these sites. So after much testing, it came to be accepted that the Adena people would have lived between about 800 BC and 1 AD, or about the time of the birth of Christ. So the Adena people, the Hopewell people and the Adena people overlapped in time for a period. And another archaeologist named Dan Dragoo came up with the theory that the Hopewell people would have originated perhaps to the north and the west of the Ohio River Valley, where the Adena people were already living, would have maybe came among them, maybe with an exciting new religion that got people worked up, and that maybe also caused some Adena people to withdraw and move away, to cross the Ohio River into Kentucky and West Virginia. In Kentucky and West Virginia today, you find Adena remains, but no Hopewell remains. And then in the 1930s, it began to look like some of the Adena people had moved even further away, when Adena-like artifacts and burial customs started showing up, first in Maryland, but then Delaware, New Jersey, New York, even as far away as Canada. And archaeologists began to debate about what exactly could this mean. Does this mean that actual people are migrating, or are they just establishing trade routes and passing along their artifacts and also their burial customs? This remains unresolved. Archaeologists are still looking at this. There's one archaeologist who works for the Smithsonian named Darren Lowry, who published a paper as recently as 2012 in which he identified a group of Adena that he called the Delmarva Adena complex. So he kind of traced them, this particular group, from the Ohio River Valley through the valleys of the Potomac and Patuxent River, across the Chesapeake Bay, up the Choptank River, to where they established a site that they used for some time. Now, William Corliss Mills was also excavating in Ohio village sites, and he recognized the people who would have made these villages as being yet a third culture in that area that lived a different kind of lifestyle than the Hopewell people and the Adena people. One village that he was excavating happened to be in the shadow of Fort Ancient, so he adopted the name Fort Ancient Culture for this third culture. And that has been confusing to this day, because the Fort Ancient on the hilltop was built by Hopewellian people. But anyway, we still use this name, Fort Ancient. And radiocarbon testing now tells us that the Fort Ancient people would have lived between about 1000 AD and 1700. Now this brings up another interesting question. If the Hopewell culture ended between about 400 and 500 AD, and the Hopewell culture ended, and then the Fort Ancient culture starts about 1000 AD, there's a gap of about 500 years there. So what had been going on in Ohio during these 500 years? We still don't know. There's not very much research done on this period. It's sometimes called the late Woodland period. But the theories are these. That the Hopewell culture would have collapsed very suddenly, abruptly, for some reason or other. We don't know why. There might have been a war, an invasion. There might have been something like an epidemic. There might have been a natural disaster. The Midwest still gets a whole lot of floods. So something happened to these Hopewell people. And then perhaps the survivors began to gradually rebuild their lives. In so doing, they would have been influenced by yet another Native American culture, which was by that time established to the south. which we call today the Mississippian Culture. Now, the Mississippian people, what did they have to offer? Well, they grew maize, which is the ancestor of corn. It would have taken many generations for the survivors of the Hopewell culture to learn about maize and also to develop a strain that was going to grow in Ohio. But as their lives changed and as they became increasingly agricultural, their lifestyles changed. Their populations grew, and instead of the isolated hamlets and hunting camps that the Hopewell people lived in, they began to establish villages, larger settlements. The villages were often palisaded. So as they were becoming more agricultural, they were also becoming more territorial and maybe more suspicious of their neighbors. If you want to visit a Fort Ancient village outside of Dayton, there's a place called Sunwatch. It is a reconstruction, but it's on the site of a real Fort Ancient village, which was excavated as recently as the 1970s and 1980s. And one of the things that archaeologists found at Sunwatch was the remains of this big, thick cedar post, which was stuck in the ground and would have extended roughly in the center of the village, and would have extended like straight up like a flagpole. Now, they also discovered that this post had sight lines, one of which lined up with a dwelling that was larger than the other dwellings in the village, and that was also situated at kind of an odd angle relative to the other dwellings. And they then discovered that the shadow of this post lined up exactly with the hearth in that particular dwelling twice a year, in the spring and in the early autumn. Times that exactly coincided when it was good timing for planting and harvesting corn in that part of Ohio. So it's kind of supposed that perhaps the astronomical knowledge of the Hopewell people was now being put to a more practical use by the Fort Ancient people. The Serpent Mound also has sight lines along these curves of its body, and they line up with the solstices and the equinoxes, rising and setting sun. So if the date of 1070 AD is correct, perhaps the Serpent Mound served the people as kind of a calendar, told you what time of the year it was. What happened to the Fort Ancient people? Well, we don't know exactly much about that either. They seem to have disappeared around 1700. Now, this is before a lot of Caucasians would have ever ventured into that area. But before they ever saw a white man, they were already handling European goods that would have been brought in by their own trading partners. Unfortunately, what the trading partners were also bringing in would have been contagious diseases to which Native Americans had no inherited resistance. So we think around 1700 and in the years following, a lot of these people just died off. There are a lot of cemeteries dating, Fort Ancient cemeteries dating from that period. The survivors, perhaps they moved away out of this place of sickness, or perhaps the Iroquois came in and either drove them out or maybe finished them off. We really don't know. To this day, there is no genetic link between the Fort Ancient people and any known modern Native American tribe. And so, research continues. One of the controversies today is, of course, we're back to that question about when exactly man first came to the Western Hemisphere. Well, we now think that man would have crossed the Bering Strait between about 14,000 and perhaps as long ago as 30,000 years ago. And for a long time, like I said, it was thought the Paleo-Indians started moving south around 12,000 BC. What happened in 12,000 BC? Climate change. The ice ages were ending, and a path south would have opened up among the glaciers that were covering most of Canada and the northern part of the United States. But it is now believed that there are some people who may have preceded the Clovis people into the southern part of the southern part of North America. How did they do this? Well, you don't have to sit around and wait for ice to melt if you can build a boat. And it's now thought that there might have been some groups of Paleo-Indians who would have gotten around the glaciers of Canada and northern United States by simply sailing down the west coast. There are some sites that radiocarbon dating has dated the remains to precede the dates when the Clovis people were supposed to have ventured south. One of these sites that's been fairly well documented is in Chile. It's called Monte Verde, and it's in southern Chile. Now that is a long way from Alaska. It's a long way to go by boat. So there's a lot about these people we don't know. And another site, which is very interesting to me, is the Croft Rock Shelter, which is in western Pennsylvania. Now, we've been there. According to their documentation, they have remains that have been discovered there that lead them to believe that it was used as a campsite as early as 16,000 years ago. So, and what's really interesting about Meadowcroft is that it's located on a creek, which happens to be kind of a natural pathway in and out of the Ohio River Valley. So perhaps this later became a path that these mound builders were using. And the point of my book, I guess, is this, that research is continuing. We don't have the market cornered on the truth. We have a lot of research still to do, both on the sites that have long been known and even sites that are being newly discovered every day. And we can't necessarily proclaim that we know the truth, because what we think we know can change with the very next discovery. And that's the end of my story for tonight. Does anybody have any questions or anything I can address? Sir?
Got the impression that when I think of monumental architecture of any sort, even just a lot of earthworks, that looks like a stratified society to organize that labor.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, the impression of Ohio doesn't seem to have evidence of that.
Well, there are theories about how these societies would have been organized. They think that the Fort Ancient societies were perhaps regulated by chiefs to some extent. The Hopewell Society, a little bit different. The supposition there is that people had not become agricultural at that time. They were still pretty much hunter-gatherers, although they might have been following what is called a Swidden agriculture, where you just sort of make a little garden and you grow things that grow natively. But because the Hopewell people lived in isolated communities, probably like little family hamlets, maybe one of the reasons why they built these monumental structures was to have a way to get together, so that your tribe could meet your tribe, and maybe you would marry each other, which might be a good thing to do. Sort of get the people together for some kind of ceremony.
But there's got to be some overreaching organization for that.
That might have been a religious something or other. We all believe the same thing. So, we understand these same symbols that we use in our artwork, like somebody might wear a cross around their neck or something like that. We know what that means. Maybe there were symbols that they knew too. But that was considered to be sort of like a more loosely organized, not a centrally organized society. There was no empire.
Right.
And maybe it was like a common religion holding these people
Is there
together.
any evidence anywhere else in the globe of that happening, though? That centralized construction like that with low population density? Because I've never encountered any readings about that. So always usually a stratified society that there's someone in charge of that can direct.
Like Egypt and Mesopotamia and stuff
Central
like that.
America, Central
Yeah,
Mexico.
yeah.
It just baffles me that you can organize labor to just move earth without concentrated settlements that are associated with hierarchical society?
Well, some of the things that are dug up with some of these burials have led archaeologists to believe that yes, they did have shamans, or I guess we would call them medicine men, who would have been sort of leaders in their society. But yeah, it's believed that the Hopewell Society was kind of loosely structured. There was no king,
Yeah.
there was no emperor, but there were reasons for people to get
Do you have
together.
any sense of what population densities?
Yeah. Well, we don't really know what the population was. Even with the burials that have been found, we don't know that it may be the burials that we're digging up with like the beautiful artifacts and stuff, they may have been important people in the society, and maybe everybody else was buried in a common grave, or, were disposed of some way that we don't know about. So we don't really know what the populations would have been like. Anybody else? Yeah.
I have to apologize. We lived in Ohio back in the early 70s, so the memory isn't what it used to be. But there was a place, as I recall, called Flint Hill or Flint Ridge,
Flint Hill.
which had a very distinctive flint that's been found
Great.
all over
Yes,
the country.
yes, yes.
Is there any
That's-
indication if that's trade material, or were people coming?
Yes, and we don't know, whether people were coming to get the flint, or the people who lived in that area were trading for other things. But yeah, that flint from Flint Ridge has been found widely scattered. Yeah, and it's a very good, nice strong flint if you want to make a good knife or a good chopping thing, or, hatchet or something like that, yeah. Ohio flint. Anybody else?
You mentioned the sites went down from about 10,000 to roughly 1,000 or so. How much of that is preserved these days, for posterity?
Well, a good site to,
somebody's yard.
at Fort Ancient, there's a museum, it's a good site to visit, it's interpreted. Mound City is interpreted. The Hopewell Culture, the Park Service Park, actually maintains several other sites besides Mound City, but they don't necessarily open them all up. I mean, they're open for archaeologists, but you can't go there and walk around. Sunwatch is a good place to visit. The Ohio History Center in Columbus has a lot of these artifacts. And if you can't visit Columbus, online, Google Ohio History Center, and in there they have a very extensive online exhibit called Virtual First Ohioans, in which they have just the weapon points, the artwork, a lot of this stuff illustrated that you can see pretty well. A lot of the Adena mounds, some of them are preserved in parks, like the Miamisburg Mound, which vies with the Grave Creek Mounds for one of the highest. Oh, the Grave Creek Mound has a museum associated with it in Moundsville. Some of these are state parks where you can walk around, but there's no interpretation. There's just a pile of dirt there. And then other areas, there are cemeteries that happen to have mounds, and that's how they got preserved. There are parks here and there in Ohio that happen to have mounds, and that's how they got preserved. So a lot of these, I would say if you're looking for a map or something like that, Ohio History Center would probably be a good place to look. Their chief archaeologist is a guy named Brian Lepper, who might be able to point you to some recent documentation that would show you, throughout Ohio, where are these things.
Does it seem like there's a reasonable percentage of what's left is protected, or?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. There's one artifact called the Alligator Mound, which looks nothing like an alligator, but a housing development grew up around it, and they're very nice houses. They're at least $500,000 houses. But the developer who developed this put a ring around the hilltop where the Alligator Mound is, and there's a sign, saying this is it, and that was undisturbed, and it's still there. There's no signs directing you to get there, and if I lived in one of those houses, I wouldn't want a lot of tourists around either, but it's there to be seen if you know where to find it. Okay, All right, yeah.
Do you have time for another?
Sure.
When you said that there was a 500-year gap, how did they decide that? Like, is there just no remains found
Yeah,
carbon
just,
dated to that
yeah,
time
like,
period, or
we
is it-
start finding these Fort Ancient remains like around 1000 AD. We haven't, there might have been Fort Ancient villages and Fort Ancient burials before that, but we haven't found them. And then the Ohio, or the Hopewell remains, they just kind of like fade out, they disappear around 500. But you know, if some disaster happened, let's say it was a big flood that wiped out, you know, like many of your ceremonial structures, many of your towns and cities, this would have disrupted society greatly. I mean, Puerto Rico still hasn't recovered, and we're in the 21st century.
Yeah.
So, you know, people would have moved around, people would have tried to find another place to go, relatives to live with, and then other people might have said, okay, let's build a house, let's try and get back to where we were. So there is this transition period, it's called the late Woodland period. Not a lot of research been done in that time period at all. Good subject for a dissertation if you're interested. Okay, I want to thank everybody for coming. It was nice.